Okay, so let's actually get started. What is a takeover?
Getting control of a company?
Getting control of a company?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, let me just, because I'm just like being fancy more than anything else, let me just find a way to write some of these things down. So getting control of a company. So what does control mean in that sense? Oops. Acquiring a controlling state. Oh, sorry, now I've gone. I want to go backwards. Control. Acquiring, interesting word. A controlling stake. So, but what does it mean to have control in that context?
Manage the organisation and its assets.
Okay, so to manage. Whoops. I'm all over the place. Yeah, I'm trying to work in a way that I can read so my handwriting's legible and yeah, it's clearly not working. So, sorry, you just said to manage.
Manage, but also to be able to direct and acquire other assets through that entity or dispose of them.
Okay, so to be... Okay.
Maybe get a big enough shareholding to get board control.
So, try again. Control, manage. So, and manage means direct operations and buy, you said.
Buy and sell.
And sell assets. Okay, so decide what the balance sheets look like, in other words. Sorry, on your screens that seems to be moving sideways, but hey, I'm pretty impressed that I've been able to write on something at all. I wonder if we'll ever get proper touch screens in here. Sorry, that was just a random act of goodness knows what. Ben, you said something, sorry?
I was thinking about like having enough ownership to control the board.
Enough ownership to control the board. So how does ownership attach, so I'm going to just link that to management, so it's also board. So controlling management is an element of control. So enough ownership, it's sort of obvious in some ways, but I really want to make sure we're talking about exactly the same thing, so I want you to go back to absolute basics. So how does ownership, Amy, I can't even see your hand from here, I just wandered up there.
So is it when you sort of acquire shares in a company, is it the creep thing as well?
So creep is a way of
Like assuming the majority shareholding in a company so that you can affect board decisions and vote.
yeah. So I want to distinguish between ways that we achieve control and what control is. So just for now, I want to actually just make sure we're all 100% on the same page as to what control means. Because, and this is the dirty little secret of takeovers law, if you understand what control really means, then you will continually ask yourself about transactions. Is control possibly affected here? And if control is possibly affected here, then you turn your mind to whether 611 applies, or sorry, whether the prohibition applies, and if the prohibition applies, then you can look to 611. Sorry, Ben, I interrupted you.
With News Corp, the Murdoch family has a bunch of very special preference shares and it guaranteed them board control, even though they own less than 20% of all of News Corp. So just by, if you came to some arrangement where you could buy out the Murdoch family shares with their preferential arrangement of board control, then you get control and then this law would apply, but you're not necessarily buying that 51%.
So how, and again, I'm really paring it back to absolute basics here. How do the Murdoch family, so are we all in agreement that those special classes of shares that they have, they're called super voting shares, that they provide that family or the holders of those shares, who happen to be family members, with control that, or an element of control that they wouldn't necessarily just have by making an investment in an ordinary share? Are we all agreed with that? So how does that happen? Why?
The special rights that are attached to those shares.
The special rights that are attached to those shares, which are? Voting rights. Voting is a really significant issue here. So that's where so voting and control over votes is ultimately a really important part of any takeover. So we end up with these rules that look to both real, direct and indirect voting power. So the language that is used often relates to things like voting power, because voting power ultimately leads to control. Sorry, Wilbur.
When we talk about control, are we talking about the ability to influence decision, whether it's minority or a majority, or you are talking about absolute control?
Okay, well, what I wanted to do is understand. I wanted to have an understanding of what control means. So you've looked at these two things: influence decisions, and then this idea. In fact, I think probably the Venn diagram would look like this: would be absolute control. Might have to wipe that and start again. But this idea that ability to influence decision is only one part of control. So what other things might there be?
But the question I'm asking is referring to the context of takeover rules. Are we talking about all, or in the legal sense, M&A space, when we talk about control, whether, because for example, in our last assignment, 1/3 of the share of the proprietary limited it's a minority control, but nevertheless, it's big enough.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Let's talk about that. So what percentage of a company do you need to appoint a director? Depends on a shareholders agreement. We're talking about public companies though. Actually, directors aren't appointed by shareholders, they're appointed by the board. But in order for them to stay, so after the board appoints a shareholder, they are required under the listing rules and most constitutions, but you would need to be, and actually the replaceable rules, and I think there might actually be a Corporations Act provision, I think that requires this anyway, that at the next general meeting of the company after a director is appointed, they need to stand for election. So what percentage of shareholders do you need to confirm a director's appointment would be a technically better way of saying it. 50%? 50% of all shareholders? 50% of those who turn up and vote. So often you can get a director over the line with 2 or 3%, you know. So control, if we say control is about decision making, and that the board itself is the ultimate decision-making entity of a company. And again, we can unpack that, because maybe a better way to do it would be to have the CEO on your payroll. And there are plenty of companies that do that when you think about how groups work. But if you are trying to control decision-making, then you need enough board seats to control the appointment of directors. You could do it with a very small percentage holding, potentially. So we need to think about, when it comes to having enough power to appoint a director, whether that influences voting control, or whether it influences decision making. What kind of percentage shareholding approval do you need to change the name of a company?
Oh, that's high. That's in the end. So can you say that again, please?
What percentage of shareholder approval do you need to change a company's name? It's a special resolution, exactly, so 75%. So if you have 30% of the company, you can block a special resolution. That of itself provides you with a level of control, doesn't it? It's a veto. And why does changing the name of a company matter? Well, often that's associated with changing the business that a company does. What shareholder control do you need, or what shareholder vote do you need to approve the sale of a company's assets? Lucky to see we are, even though this gentleman here was awake at 5:30 with his small child, he is literally awake. You don't. As a general rule, unless the prohibitions that we're going to talk about would require that. If the company is listed, there are listing rule requirements around shareholder approval for the sale of a substantial asset or a change in the nature of the business. Many companies, particularly companies that aren't listed and that have stranger on their share register, will have shareholders agreements or even constitutional provisions that require the approval of the members to a substantial change of some sort. So in the assignment that you did recently, the starting point term sheet would have provided some general outline of the kinds of things that might be in a shareholders agreement from memory, and started with those control provisions. In fact, somebody asked me an excellent question, I can't remember who it is at the moment, about what acting in concert meant, which is one of the provisions that was in the original shareholders agreement. I shouldn't do this actually, because you all get scared if you haven't raised the question, and you know, it was just a question. There are plenty of opportunities for people to shine in that assignment, I'm sure. But we will be talking about acting in concert here in this context, and we will be talking about that ability of people to work together. So because control often can be achieved not by one person, but by a group of people with similar interests. So another thing that we spend a lot of time talking about is who's associated with who. And we refer to it often as the tracing provisions or the associate reference, but we're looking at where a person, and remember a person isn't necessarily a human, it might be an entity, either alone or with their associates or associated entities, the extent to which they achieve voting power. Questions, concerns, thoughts?
What about for example, a financing group in form of soft convertible loan? They provide convertible loans, so they do have a level of control.
Yeah, well, and you're going from 0 to 100 really quickly here. No, that's okay. That's what we should do. That's why we do it in this format, so we can have discussions all the time. Mostly what I'm going to use is examples of acquisitions of ordinary shares. But at the end of the day, any transaction that could result in a prohibited change to voting power needs to be structured either can't happen or needs to be structured to fit within one of the exemptions. So does everybody understand what a convertible note is or a convertible instrument is? In a nutshell, a convertible note or a convertible instrument is a form of debt. So debt at a corporate level is usually structured, or often structured as a bond or a note. So, and again, that's just so you're paying a business broker a large amount of money, I think, because they're just loan agreements at the end of the day. They're just called a bond, but they're structured as an instrument or a security that can then be on-sold. It can be packaged and on-sold to other people. And a convertible note is essentially a loan to a company that can be converted into equity at some future time. The interest that's paid on the loan, it's usually referred to as a coupon, is usually a fixed amount. And again, for reasons more to do with tax than anything else, the decision whether the note can be converted to debt or equity is usually in the hands of the lender. So it's not like I can... so we had Ting Yu's amazing gallery that was doing really well. She's now listed. Well, the company itself is listed. She's looking at another... Where do you want to expand to this time? We've taken over Tasmania. Where would you like to go this time? Where will we start? Sorry? Alice Springs, okay? Alice Springs is the next home. Hop, step and a jump from Launceston. Oh no, it's Hobart that you were in, isn't it? And so, but look at how well the business is doing. And she's thinking, well, if I issue new shares to... Anybody want to make an investment in Alice Springs? Wilbur, you look interested in this whole idea of investing in an art gallery in Alice Springs. And Wilbur's incredibly wealthy. Just look at him, he's dripping with it. He's trying to get something off the ground and he thinks, well, he would like to invest in this company. One point of view is Ting Yu is absolutely convinced, as the CEO and major shareholder of the Ting Yu Awesome Art Gallery, that it is going to absolutely go off at some future time, might be trading. What kind of market value do you think your company has at the moment? Around 100 mil? Small cap? About 100 mil. Trading let's say 100 million shares at $1 a share. She's convinced they're going to be worth $1.50 soon. But she might think, well, I don't want to dilute that interest. I don't want to issue new shares. I own 50% now, but if we issue new shares to Wilbur to raise that money to finance our new operation in Alice Springs, my shareholding is going to be reduced down to 40%. And I want to keep as much as possible. So I'll issue him a loan, a convertible note, and then if I decide later, if the share price goes down, I'll decide then to turn it into equity. And if the share price goes up, I'll just repay the loan. That sounds awesome, but it doesn't actually usually work like that. What would happen is it's more likely that Wilbur would be saying, yeah, I'm pretty sure this is a $100 million company. I can see the revenues. I think they can repay this loan. But they do have some upside here and they might actually go up in value. So if I agree to issue, how much do you want to loan them? $1 million bucks? You wouldn't get out of bed for less than $1 million. 50 million, nah. But see, that's right. It's very hard to get a small loan from a guy like Wilbur. So he wants to issue you a $50 million loan. He'll issue each note, or you'll issue him each note at $1. With a coupon. What's your coupon going to be? Look at her. She's raised. She's got $1 million company for an art gallery in Hobart. She's no idiot. What's she going to pay on your coupon? She'll pay 1.3% coupon. She'll pay 1.3, and you're guaranteed that. You can see that she's going to be able to get that. But if it turns out that she's right and her shares are worth $1.50 later on, you might actually exercise your right to convert. And you would be then making a decision between, let's say, 12-month period, $50 million times 1.3, that's his return, or $25 million. Which one do you think he's going to pick? So, but if the share price went down to 50 cents, his choice is 50 million times 1.3%, or a loss, effectively, based on current share price of $25 million. Which one do you think he's going to pick? So, and he may well have been doing it for a tax benefit. I think all of Ting Yu's investors are in there for a capital loss that they might actually want the benefit of. But even so, it might reduce your tax in the short term, but you're still wearing a loss. Like every, tax deduction in that sense is based on money that is no longer in your pocket. So, getting back to, that's kind of what the transaction for a convertible note looks like. If he's going to lend her $50 million on the basis that he has the right to convert that to equity is there the potential for a control change or a change in control? Yeah. So it hasn't actually happened yet, but there is the potential. And the control, the decision as to whether that should happen or not is in his hands. So that kind of transaction would require to be structured in a way that fits within the exceptions in section 611. And most likely, well, that's a ridiculous transaction, by the way, $50 million loan for one new art gallery in Alice Springs, but let's say that the most likely way that that would be addressed is by putting it to the shareholders. And it's most likely that Tingnu's shareholders would say, hang on a minute, why is he getting this deal and we're not? And so it would probably then be structured as a rights issue, so where convertible notes would be offered by the company to all of the shareholders and effectively underwritten by Wilbur, who would mop up everything that was left over. And you'd probably get another 2% for the underwriting, actually. Better deal for you. All right. I might have done something that means that I've got scribble on all of my slides now. Let's see. No, it's not even moving. Yes, I have. Beautiful. Erase ink on all slides. Let's just see if that will work. Sorry, I just need to restart my slide pack and start again. Otherwise, that's just going to do my OCD head in. Do I want to keep them? No, I don't. It's professionally prudent, but somewhat dull. Is this where we're going with this?
No, I'm just used to not having to concentrate all the time.
I love your honesty. Okay, so your textbook, or the recommended textbook, which is Redmond, says that a takeover is the process of gaining control of a company, the target, by bidding under a formal process for sufficient shares to achieve that end. Yes, that is what we usually mean when we talk about a takeover. What we're talking about in this subject and over these 2 days is transactions that would require that formal process. The study notes say that transactions are aimed at changing control of the voting power exercisable at a general meeting, which is, well, I wrote the study notes, so that's my working definition of what we're really talking about in this context. So, as alluded to in our discussion before, oh, sorry, Mark.
I have a question about directors and control. Isn't it more, I don't really know, but influence rather than control? So you've got 7 directors, and you've got 2. You've got influence, but you haven't got control. You might win something and lose others, but if you've got 3, you've got a bit more influence.
Yep.
Continuum rather than black or white.
So we talk about this because takeovers are about changing control or control transactions, then we use this language around control. But again, going back to Wilbur's language earlier, it's not a black and white thing. It's not absolute control versus no control. You can't just skate so close to control, which means that you have it sometimes that you don't. You either have influence or sufficient influence or not. And at the end of the day, we'll work through how these criteria work, but effectively the law says from a formula point of view, if you directly or indirectly can direct the votes of 20% or more of the company's shares in any class, then you have a substantial holding in that class. You might never win a vote, but you certainly get a hearing. So, and the thing is, for all the reasons that we'll talk about, there is no absolute. There is no absolute. It is so dependent on so many things. So we particularly look at this, remind me we get to the very end of takeovers and we'll look at the mopping up of minorities in particular, and how we look at how the votes in schemes are counted, because it's really difficult to know how a vote will actually be exercised and whether or not you're counting everybody who cares. It's a bit like the ongoing argument between whether compulsory voting or non-compulsory voting is more or less democratic. So, yeah. But let's look at some of the ways that you can affect transfers or changes in control of a corporation or a business. So what we've been speaking about so far, you're feeling happy? Sorry, you make me laugh. Is a lot of the transactions that we've been speaking about up till now, which are the vast majorities of the ways that corporate control moves in Australian transactions, are buying and selling shares and businesses. Okay, in the small business unregulated space. So most of what we'll be talking about this weekend really only impacts companies that have 50 shareholders or more. And again, I've already just been imprecise in that sentence. What did I say that was imprecise?
50 shareholders or more.
No, the other part. Companies. Companies. It only affects entities that have 50% of shareholders or more. Not all entities are companies, but the range, if an entity has more than 50 members or shareholders or the equivalent, whatever, unit holders, whatever they happen to be called, then the rules that we'll be talking about will affect them. But when we've got less than 50 unit holders in trust, beneficiaries of a trust, proprietary limited shareholders, members of a scheme.
Does that mean it would also apply to sort of like your not-for-profit membership organisations? If they have members?
That's a really good question. Let's unpick that.
By another, similar but different.
So, a not-for-profit.
I'm thinking like if Scouts Victoria tried to take over Scouts New South Wales, they're both.
The short answers to that, yeah. My guess is I don't know how they're how they're.
Corporations Association under the 2012 Victorian Act.
Well, I think it depends on, because obviously the Scouts New South Wales isn't incorporated in Victoria.
Which creates another set of problems. Let's say that they're companies limited by guarantee, which is quite a usual way. So the members of those associations.
Limited by guarantee.
Yeah. So what the members of those associations, or a member of a company that's limited by guarantee, what rights come with membership? Voting rights? Dividends? No. Return of capital? Got a feeling it might actually. Oh no, it doesn't. I think that usually the constitutions need to say that on winding up, any capital will go somewhere else.
They have no financial distribution, but there's certain benefits for the fees they pay.
Yeah. So there's an annual fee, usually an annual fee obligation, and then your membership drops away, and it might not be.
But they're events.
So essentially, yeah, the rules still apply. The kinds of structures that you use to merge are usually quite different. In fact, they're the things that schemes are made for. And in fact, what I'm actually involved in, Women in Finance Victoria, is being essentially run out at the moment on the basis that all of the activities will be taken over by Women in Finance, Women in Banking and Finance, which is a New South Wales association. Cheapest, easiest, most effective way to achieve that quote-unquote merger, which is really what it is. It's aligning two organisations that have the same values and activities and merging their bank accounts, is essentially to had a meeting of the members to make sure everybody was happy, made a couple of fairly large donations, some of them to causes that the organisation had supported, like Women for Work, or whatever it is. I can't remember what it's called. The find dresses for people who need to do job interviews charity. And anyway, that really doesn't matter.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Really, that's not really, it's not going to be on the test, whatever I just said then. And then so the reason for getting the bank account down to less than $5,000 is otherwise on winding up we'd need to have an audit, and that seemed to be a ridiculous thing to spend money on when 3/4 of the membership is auditors. So we just got the actual bank balance down to below the number, largely by making a large donation to the organisation that we were going to merge with. Basically wind the thing up. Under the Constitution, anything that's left over needs to be given to an organisation that has similar values. Wouldn't you know it, all those values went over there, and essentially the other organisation offered our members new free memberships for the balance of the period that they were paid up for in the existing organisation. So
is that a scheme of arrangement?
it was done outside the scheme of arrangement because, in fact, there weren't 50 members at that point in time. But yeah, if there'd been more than 50 members, we probably would have waited till a new membership year because it was all going to be too expensive otherwise. But if there'd been more than 50 members, then we would have needed to do an audit and do a scheme. But it would have been that would be the easiest way to do it.
That would be subject to the members' approval.
Yeah. Oh, and we had 100% member approval, by the way, for the actual plan.
I have actually a association, and other states, well, the association of another states trying
Yeah.
to take over, but the board just make the decision
Without going to the members, yeah. Probably not such a good thing. But Elisa's question is a good one. Yes, it works for not-for-profits. But when we look at Section 611, from memory, so the way the regime works is a general prohibition, which we haven't even got to yet. So essentially, you can't do transactions that are going to affect control outside of the parameters unless one of the exceptions in 611 applies. And 611 lists 20 of those exceptions. So it's not like there's a shortage of opportunities for thinking about how to get around them. And interestingly, formal takeover, so an on-market or an off-market takeover, are just 2 of the exceptions. So there are 18 other ways of doing it. Scheme is another one. Okay. So, getting back to my point, so the vast majority of transactions that affect change of control are just buying and selling companies. Sometimes it's just about selling the assets and then winding up one business, moving the assets across into another business, changing them around in some way. The other way that control is changed is issuing new shares. So when we started this process and Tingu set up her gallery initially, one of the first things that she did was issue some shares to, was it you, Shushu, who got the shares? Yes, I think so. Shushu got invested some of her hard-earned and became a co-shareholder. You're doing very well, by the way, now. It's a $100 million company. I would assume that you've still got quite a large percentage. Well done. But the other ways that can happen too is change of management. So the person who really has ultimate decision-making power in most cases in any organisation is the CEO. So is appointing a CEO potentially a change in control? Possibly. Okay, in what circumstances then would appointing a CEO be a change of control?
If the CEO was aligned with board members who were appointed and a specific mandate that was preset.
Yeah, I think so. So aligned there, what we would need to do is look at the associate reference. So if the CEO themselves and together with their associates actually could exercise voting control over the company. So let me give you an example. I can't think of a real world example. I'm going to make one up. When Steve Jobs was booted out of Apple a million years ago, he did a number of things, including investing in a small company called Pixar, which went on to make a very large amount of money. Everything I've read about it, they did everything they could to keep him out of the place, but anyway, it's kind of interesting. So let's say, so he has a very large share of Pixar and a reasonable share of Apple. He has no management position at Pixar. Let's say instead of him going back to, I'm just trying to think about the best way to put this. What would happen if a Pixar, oh no, it's the other way around. If, what's his name? Who's the CEO of Apple now? Tim Shaughnessy? Tim Cook. Where have I got Shaughnessy from? I can see his face. Anyway, Tim Cook. Let's say Tim Cook decided to go and be the CEO of Pixar at the same time. Right now. So today, he takes on a role at Pixar. Steve Jobs' estate presumably still owns a relatively large chunk of Apple. It still presumably owns a large chunk of Pixar. Let's, for the purpose of the exercise, assume that Tim Cook is on the board of the company that makes decisions about what happens with Tim Jobs' estate. Would Steve Jobs' estate. Okay, sorry, is this word picture making any sense to anybody? So we've got two companies, Pixar and Apple, for the purposes of the example. Steve Jobs' estate owns big chunks of both of them. Tim Cook is the CEO of Apple. Presumably he has Apple shares as well. Let's assume Apple has some shares in Pixar as well, make it easy. And Tim Cook is also an executor or on the board of the group that looks after the estate of the late and great Steve Jobs. Do you think Tim Cook being appointed as the CEO of Pixar might result in a change in the control environment? Amy's nodding her head. I do too, because now we've got somebody on the management team who also can make decisions about how, in the scenario I gave you, at least two large swathes of Pixar shares can be voted. The shares that are owned by Apple and the shares that are owned by the estate. So previously, as an external, he had the ability to make calls about how the Apple would vote at Pixar meetings. But and it might even be that the change control situation happens at the point at which he becomes a controller of the estate itself, depending on what the percentages are. I'm applying Australian law, by the way, to a fictional American situation. You always let the facts get in the way of a good story, don't you? I picked the wrong one. I forget that the person who knows most about Apple is here. But these kind of things, those changes, even outside, I was trying to come up with something where there might be a change as a consequence of a CEO being appointed. But quite often CEO appointments come with increases in investment. So you will see transactions that happen on market where a group might acquire a substantial but not controlling interest in a company and then might second a staff member over to be the CEO. So even at numbers below substantial shareholding, they may actually have a requirement to declare that, to declare the association at that point, because they're effectively creating control.
Does the law actually allow this sort of conflict of interest?
Again, it's a prohibition approach. Sorry, I started speaking before I heard the end of your question, which was A, rude, apologies, and secondly meant I started to answer a different question. So firstly, in relation to the transaction, which is not the question you asked, but the one I'm going to answer, is the mechanism works as a prohibition. Certain transactions are prohibited unless an exemption applies. So the exemption would need to apply. Secondly, in relation to the conflicts of interest, that is it's kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about in this course, but it's a very, very real question. And again, managed under US law quite differently from how it's managed here. So warning to those of you who research via Google that what you read about the management of conflict of interests by directors in the States takes some care. But yeah, the question becomes, can a director effectively do their job? Because who does a director owe duties to? All shareholders. I heard something else here. To the company as a whole. So that means, yes, it includes the shareholders. It also includes creditors. It also includes employees. It can be very difficult at times to work out what that actually means. It can be to growth. It can be to a whole range of different things. If a person is a director of two companies and one company owns the other company, do they owe greater duties to the company that is the owner? So let me give you an example. I'm a director of BHP. BHP owns, I saw a mine the other day in New South Wales. It was on the coal coast, which I thought was hilarious. So BHP owns this mine on the coal coast, a coal mine, and I've been appointed as a director in my capacity as a BHP employee. I'm of that mine. I'm a director of BHP Billiton, the listed company, and I'm also a director of this mine. Presumably, I owe many more duties to BHP, the parent company, than I do to this tiny little mine in the Illawarra. Is that right? No, it's not. So what happens when my tiny little mine in the Illawarra is having a fight with BHP? So BHP is saying, you have to run on the smell of an oily rag. And I'm saying, well, actually, I'm very concerned that we won't be able to pay our debts as and when they fall due. Unless we have more financing, we need to borrow this money, the bank has approved it, internal processes say that you need to approve it too, and you're saying no, so I have to do what you say. Is that right?
That's what happens.
It's what happens, but is it right? Is that what the law says?
Well, but having board representation for another associate company is different from having the CEO.
It's a complex set of questions. If it's 100% owned, it probably is right. And there are mechanisms. If it's not 100% owned, in practice what is likely to happen is that the director will abstain when there is a conflict. And we're going to talk about a number of these things where it will probably surprise none of you to know that there are many directors who are directors of many different companies. The actual number of directors of listed companies is quite small compared to the actual number of companies. And so it's not at all unusual for a bidder, for a person to be a director of both a bidder and a target, which leads to all sorts of potential issues. But bidder and the... Well, recusing is one way of dealing with it. Sometimes the act of recusing itself creates or releases. Well, if you are a director of a company and you are aware that that company is formulating a bid for another company that you're a director of, you can recuse yourself from the conversations that the bidder is having, but the fact that you are aware of information about the existence of a bid actually is information that you are most, I would say, duty bound to disclose. But to disclose that would actually be a breach. So again, it's managed has to be managed quite carefully. And I mean, actually, as shareholders of companies, as owners of funds in superannuation funds, do you want to be paying directors the big bucks to not go to meetings because they have a conflict?
No. They're not a director.
So resignation is often a drastic step, but that raises the issues as well. So
would that vote then not count, that director's vote potentially not count if they've recused themselves, but they're still taking that vote?
Depends, again, a lot of that stuff is very opaque. When it comes to scheme documentation, and the directors are required to make a recommendation, same with the target statements, there usually needs to be a statement of who voted and what their reasons, or whether they're recommending for or against. But yeah, it's complex. This is not what I wanted to be talking about right now, though. So no, that's okay. I'm just going to pay attention to the time. So again, the formal on and off market processes are really just one mechanism for getting there. And I would suggest, I probably could have spent a little bit more time playing with the graphics for this slide. It sort of looks like a process from one side to the other. I think it would probably be better presented as a kind of funnel, in the sense, if we were thinking about the numbers of transactions, the transactions at this end, let me do this so that people on the other end can see what I'm talking about. Whoops. The ones that are in this space, oh, sorry, I forgot that I had more slides on there. The stuff that I've just highlighted now, that by number are significantly the largest number. And when it comes to, schemes of arrangement too for friendly takeovers are by far the largest number as well now, because it's just a much more efficient, manageable scheme. Okay, another little note that I wanted to point out to you. In the Canvas shell, there is a grid with so many cases. I'd forgotten how many there were. So I think you'll remember this is actually the first subject that I ever taught when I came to RMIT, and the materials were already prepared for me when I arrived. And in fact, there was just that list of cases with no actual statement as to what they were about. So when I was reading to do the prep, I made some quick notes about why the cases were important. And I suspect, like many of you, I was a bit surprised when I saw it. I clearly had problems letting go because I'd put all that work into doing that prep. Since then, I put a lot more work into changing the course so that it's not 100% about takeovers and schemes anymore, that we're actually doing a bit more about the sale and purchase of businesses as well. So those last 2 days have been added in since, and this bit is being truncated compared to how it was done initially. And I obviously couldn't let go, and I've left all those cases in. So I just wanted you to know they're there, they might be useful to you. They really haven't been updated now since 2013 in any meaningful way. Actually, there might be a couple more that were in there since in 2015. I haven't updated it at all for this slot. Do not feel that you have to read all of those cases. I'm not seeing anybody burst into tears. I'm assuming that none of you have made an attempt to read any of them so far. Sorry?
I just read the comments.
You read the comments?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's good. That's where I did the work. I don't know how useful they would be. But the good thing is, as I said before, if you are reading cases, so many of those are takeovers decision cases, and they are actually quite awesome to read. All right, so we've been talking a bit about control and what effective control is. Anything else on this slide that we haven't actually already covered? Yeah.
A peripheral one. Going back to the example of someone like Steve Jobs' estate, for example. Let's just take somebody who's a trustee of that estate, and they've got control over a sort of, big shareholding in both groups. There are circumstances in which someone can start to assert control by nature of having a nice big meaty shareholding or being an influential figure.
Yep.
Steve Jobs, when he controlled or owned part of Pixar, could show up just by being Steve Jobs and go,
Yep.
Give me the floor at this AGM.
Absolutely.
Is that covered by the prohibition?
Not so much by the prohibitions as it is by, in Australian law, by the very broad definition that we have about who's caught within the definition of a director. So the definition of director in the Corps Act doesn't limit itself to somebody who has been appointed by the board and voted in by the shareholder. It basically has what I call like the duck definition. If it looks like a director, if it sounds like a director, if people are habitually following instructions as if that person was a director, then that person is a director. And that follows through in the way when we have a look at what the definition is of an associate or a related entity, whether or not there is actual effective control. So you don't need a written agreement. You don't need to have a formal position. The law, which is based on the Eggleston principles, which we'll get to shortly, look to what is actually really happening. So again, it's an interesting area in the sense that it's from the point of view of a subject I teach, other than competition when I taught that, we have a very heavy legislative focus, but it also has that high level what's really going on focus and puts the onus then back on the companies. Similarly to the IPO provisions, where the duties that are with the directors are to disclose everything. It's not to meet the requirements on a list. So similarly, it works that way. Does that answer your question? Cool. I think that we've covered everything that I wanted to talk about here. It is worth thinking about what different voting power numbers give you. So 50% plus 1 will always give you the ability to carry a resolution at a general meeting. 75% plus 1 vote will give you the ability to pass a special resolution. Similarly, 25% plus 1 will give you the ability to veto a special resolution, which itself is a type of control.
Wouldn't it be 35% plus 1?
75 plus, yeah, 25.
25 plus 1 would give you the ability to veto.
Isn't that what I said?
I thought you said 75, sorry.
75 is 75 gives you the ability to carry the special resolution, 75 plus 1. 25 plus 1 gives you the ability to veto it. 90%. What does 90% give you?
Acquisition.
Sorry?
Well, then what do you call it? Mandatory acquisition.
It gives you the right to require minority, the other 10%, to sell their shares to you. And we'll look at that when we get to the mopping up of the minorities. So the compulsory acquisition provisions kick in at 90%. Okay, control. Let's look at what control means. Okay. The first ones, sorry, I'm just making sure that we've covered them all. So at the beginning, consolidation of accounts is in a sense an ability to control. So from an accounting point of view, the ability to consolidate for GST purposes, for tax purposes, or to consolidate for financing purposes is an element of control. It's an ability to operate businesses as a quasi-group. Boardroom control is a type of control. Effective control at a general meeting we've already just spoken about. An entitlement to a simple majority of votes at a general meeting. So that's the News Limited type control. Having an entitlement to control the votes in a meeting, regardless of what your shareholding numbers are. At 90%, you have an entitlement to implement compulsory acquisitions. And of course, if you've got 100% ownership of the shares, if you want to, you can convert your entity, if it isn't already one, into a proprietary limited company, have a sole director and a single shareholder, which itself might be a company, but might be an individual, doesn't matter. So at 100%, you can do whatever you like, effectively. So you don't have what you called absolute control, that 100% control, until you have 100%. But at 90%, you have the right to get it. Oh, actually, I did separate out the difference. 100% ownership of voting shares and 100% of all shares. It's quite rare, but it is actually possible to separate out voting and non-voting shares. It's not that unusual, even in quite small companies, to have a class of employee share, for example, that don't have any voting rights attached to them, but have a dividend or some sort of other return attached to them. If you had a company that was 100% owned by one person that issued a convertible note, convertible notes don't usually carry a vote with them, but there would be they are a security that's issued by the company. So they might, because they're capable of converting into shares, you might have a situation where they existed. Okay, so this is my very lame attempt at trying to make sure that we can map out exactly what we're talking about here. So what we're doing here is primarily concerned with changes of control impacting public companies. So by public companies, I don't necessarily mean listed companies, I mean public entities. And in particular, what we're looking at is where a change occurs because there is a change in control over the shares in the public company. So most companies are private. So if we've got, this is a very lame Venn diagram, so if we've got all companies, we've got one section where companies are private, and if we were doing that as a proportion of all companies that are on the ASIC register, we would find that that is a much larger proportion. All listed companies are public companies. Okay, so all listed companies are public companies, but not all listed entities are companies. Not all public companies are listed. So we can have public companies that are unlisted companies. And in fact, the vast majority of public companies are not listed companies. Not all listed entities are companies. So we have managed investment schemes, trusts, entities that are incorporated in foreign jurisdictions. They might be listed on the ASX, but they are not companies registered under the Corporations Act or under Australian law. Not all private entities are companies either. So there are a range of different entities that still might be affected by the kinds of laws that we're talking about, but still might be proprietary companies, or not public. So incorporated associations, which we were talking about earlier, that's state-by-state regime still. Partnerships, managed investment schemes, trusts, again, foreign entities. Many, but not all, of the relevant rules apply to companies that are not listed. So even though we're going to focus on listed companies and how the takeovers regime applies to them, these provisions may still apply to non-listed companies. They may still apply to listed entities that are not companies, they may not apply to those entities as well. We need to inquire in each instance. The basic rule is if there is more than 50 members, shareholders, unit holders, whatever the term is for ownership and voting rights that attach to the entity, then the listing rule, the prohibitions in Chapter 6 will apply.